at 89. She no longer has anything to protect. Her voice is thin, almost brittle, but her first sentence freezes the entire room. I love Sophia Loren, and Cary knew it. For more than half a century, Hollywood labeled her as a friend, a colleague, never the woman caught inside a forbidden triangle the studios worked desperately to erase. Contracts were rewritten, interviews edited, entire narratives rearranged to hide a bond that should never have existed between Cary Grant, the industry's flawless gentleman, and Sophia Loren, the rising star trapped inside calculated marriages and studio expectations. Today, for the first time, the woman they silenced finally speaks. So what truth did Hollywood bury for more than 60 years? In the late 1,950 seconds. If you opened a magazine in America or Europe, chances are you would see his face or hers. Cary Grant was more than a movie star by then. He was the blueprint, the suit that never wrinkled, the smile that never cracked, the man every studio head pointed to when they whispered, "That is how a leading man should look." His walk was measured, his voice controlled, his charm effortless. Even his flaws were curated into anecdotes. Divorce, loneliness, doubt, all polished down into witty late-night stories and elegant black-and-white stills. To the public, there was no space between the man and the image. Cary Grant was perfection, and perfection did not need explanation. Sophia Loren arrived in that world like something cinema had been waiting for without knowing it. She was not the fragile blonde Hollywood had been recycling for decades. She was fire, carved in shadows and sunlight, with eyes that seemed to remember all the lives she had lived before the cameras ever found her. In Italy, she was already a phenomenon. On red carpets, people turned before they even realized why. Directors spoke of her in reverent tones. Critics called her myth-made flesh. When she finally stepped onto American soil, the headlines did the rest. Overnight, she became the woman who could stand beside any man on screen and not disappear. When the studios put Cary Grant and Sophia Loren together in The Pride and the Passion in 1957, it looked, on paper, like a simple business decision. Pair the most polished gentleman in Hollywood with the most dazzling newcomer, put them against a backdrop of war, passion, and spectacle. Sell posters of their faces, almost touching, their bodies framed by cannons and smoke. The public would pay to watch the sparks. The math was easy. On set, the illusion deepened. News photographers captured them laughing between takes, her head thrown back, his hand resting lightly near her elbow. In still photographs, he looked like the anchor and she like the storm. Reporters wrote about their effortless chemistry, then quickly added that they were, of course, just professionals. Studio press releases repeated the same phrases over and over. Good friends, deep respect, wonderful working relationship, nothing more, nothing less. Yet the people who stood closer than the cameras noticed things the articles never mentioned. The way his posture changed when she entered the room, like someone unconsciously standing a little taller. The way she relaxed when he was near, as if his presence allowed her, for a brief moment, to stop performing for everyone else. Between scenes, there were long silences that did not feel empty. He would sit beside her, not touching, not speaking much, but not leaving either. She would trace patterns on the arm of her chair, eyes distant, listening to something only she could hear. To the world. Cary Grant's life was already neatly defined. The suave bachelor, the devoted husband when the script required it, the polished divorcee who always landed on his feet. Gossip columns hinted at restlessness, at a man who kept searching, but the studio machinery smoothed every rumor into a narrative of charm. He was the gentleman who never lost control, the screen idol who never made a mess. Sophia Loren's story, too, was rewritten to fit the American dream. The poor girl from Naples who rose from nothing. The Cinderella whose fairy godmother wore a studio badge and carried a contract instead of a wand. Her engagement, her marriage, her alliances were presented as steps in a grand design. Strategic, respectable, inevitable. When questions about her private life came too close to the edge, publicists stepped in. Smiles were rehearsed. Answers were memorized. "We are happy," she would say, and the cameras would nod. The pride and the passion allowed the public to believe they were watching two characters fall in love on screen, and only that. Posters framed them as a perfect cinematic pair. Interviews edited out anything that might blur the lines between role and reality. When one journalist dared to ask if the emotions in certain scenes came from somewhere more personal, the official answer was short and final. They were professionals. They were friends. End of discussion. But away from the press conferences, the crew told different stories in quiet voices years later. A camera operator remembered how the atmosphere shifted when a scene required the two of them to stand too close for too long. An assistant recalled finding them alone on set after everyone else had left, sitting on opposite sides of an empty stage, speaking softly in a mixture of English and Italian, words she could not quite hear but would never forget. A wardrobe girl swore she once saw Sophia emerge from Cary's dressing room with eyes that were a little too bright, insisting she had only come to ask about a costume change that had already been decided hours before. None of this ever reached the gossip pages. None of it became headline material. Whenever a rumor began to take shape, studio phones rang, meetings were held, and narratives were adjusted. Cary was photographed at a charity event with a respectable companion. Sophia was interviewed about her commitment to the man waiting for her off-set, a powerful figure the studios preferred attached to her name. The message was clear. Whatever the public thought it saw on screen was just acting, nothing more. And yet, for those willing to look past the official stories, something did not quite fit. The chemistry in their scenes felt too organic, too unforced. A glance held a fraction of a second longer than the script seemed to require. A hand rested where it did not need to linger. The final cuts looked almost restrained, as if someone in the editing room had been careful not to let the truth leak through the frame. Audiences left the theaters convinced they had witnessed a grand, impossible love story contained safely within the borders of fiction. Cary Grant remained the immaculate gentleman. Sophia Loren remained the untouchable goddess. Together, they became another beautiful myth Hollywood could package and sell. But behind the elegance lay a truth neither of them was allowed to live. She says the first time she realized something was wrong was not on a set, not in a dressing room, but in a hotel corridor at 3 a.m. The shoot had ended hours before. The lights were off. The long, carpeted hallway felt like a tunnel. Cary was sitting on the floor outside his own door, back against the wall, still in his shirt and tie, staring at nothing, no drink in his hand, no script on his lap, just silence. When she asked him if he was all right, he did not answer at first. Then he looked up and said, very softly, "Some things you are not allowed to want. Not in this town." By this town, he meant Hollywood. But she understood he was not talking about career or money. Those he already had. It was something else he had decided, or been forced, to live without. For decades, the public believed Cary Grant was a man who always knew what he was doing. The controlled voice, the precise smile, the perfect timing. In private, he was less certain. The woman now sitting in front of the camera at 89 describes a man who could spend an entire evening rehearsing a single sentence he would never say. He would stand by the window of whatever rented room the studio had put him in, cigarette unlit between his fingers, going over the same line silently. "You do not have to choose them. You can choose me instead." The words never left his lips when the person who needed to hear them was in the room. Sophia Loren was not naive when she met him. She had grown up in a world where survival was louder than romance. War, hunger, cramped apartments, a life built from almost nothing. By the time Hollywood invited her in, she already knew that behind every contract there was a price. On set, she carried herself like a woman who understood the difference between love and opportunity and had accepted that most people would choose the latter. But she did not anticipate the way Cary looked at her. Not the way a co-star looks at a partner, checking marks and angles. It was closer to recognition, almost relief, as if he had finally found someone who understood the weight of pretending for so long. Between takes, they talked about things that did not belong to the script: childhood, fear, what it meant to be turned into a product. She would joke about being assembled by the studios, dress by dress, photograph by photograph. He would laugh, then fall quiet and say, "They assembled me too. I just started earlier." The woman at 89 remembers watching them from a distance, feeling both drawn in and pushed out. She cared for Cary. At one point, she believed he might care for her in a way that was more than friendship. They spent nights talking in hotel bars long after everyone else had gone to bed. He told her things he had never admitted in interviews, about the young man he had been, the anger he hid, the fear of being seen without a role to play. And yet, even in those intimate hours, there was a line he never crossed. When the subject drifted toward Sophia, something in him shifted. His tone softened. His eyes moved to some point beyond the room. He would say her name slowly, as if the syllables themselves needed to be handled with care. "Sophia is different," he would murmur, and then stop, as if going any further would set off an alarm only he could hear. For Loren, the pressure came from another direction. She was still under the shadow of a man whose influence could make or break her career, a man who stood behind her in photographs, hands resting on her shoulders like a claim. The industry wanted her to fit into a specific story: the faithful protégé, the loyal partner, the woman whose choices were already decided. Falling in love with the most desired leading man in Hollywood did not fit into that script. On set, she learned to redirect questions. When journalists hinted at more than chemistry between her and Cary, she would smile politely and credit the director, the lighting, the magic of cinema. In interviews, she called him kind, professional, charming, always choosing words that distanced herself from the truth she was trying to manage. In private, away from the microphones, she was less composed. The 89-year-old remembers finding her once alone in a makeup chair after everyone had left, still in costume, staring at her reflection as if it belonged to someone else. "You cannot love two worlds at the same time," Sophia said quietly when she realized she was not alone. "One always gets offended." It was not hysteria. It was resignation. She knew that to choose Cary openly would mean declaring war on forces much larger than either of them: studios, contracts, reputations, legal ties that went far beyond romance. She had grown up with too little security to treat stability lightly. And yet, the way she watched him when he turned away, the way her shoulders deflated when he left a room, betrayed how much the choice cost her. For Cary, the conflict cut even deeper. He had spent years crafting a version of himself he could survive inside. The suave mask was not just for the cameras, it was armor. Letting it slip in front of Sophia meant exposing someone he was not sure she or the world would accept. The rumor mills always circled his private life, inventing stories, questioning, speculating. He knew how fast whispers could become headlines, and how quickly headlines could turn to judgment. So he did what he had always done when faced with something too dangerous to hold. He turned it into performance. On screen, he allowed himself to be as in love as he truly was, because there it could be called acting. Off screen, he joked, deflected, changed the subject. When someone on set teased him about how convincing the romantic scenes looked, he replied, "That is what they pay us for," then walked away before anyone could see his hands shaking. The woman at 89 was caught in the crossfire of all of this. She had her own feelings, her own quiet hopes, and they did not survive what happened on that film. She admits it now, without bitterness, just a tired honesty. "I thought, for a time, that he might choose a quieter life with someone like me," she says. "But you cannot compete with a person who lives inside someone's soul. You cannot compete with a ghost that has not even died yet." She watched as small, almost invisible compromises piled up. The scenes between Cary and Sophia became more charged, then more restrained, as if both were afraid of revealing too much in front of the world, and yet unable to fully disguise what was happening between them. A hand pulled back, a fraction of a second too soon. A kiss, filmed in fewer takes than necessary because the room had grown too still. A director cutting a moment that felt too raw, mumbling something about pacing when everyone knew it was about control. When the production ended, reality reasserted its rules. Schedules changed. Planes were booked. Contracts were enforced. Public statements were issued to assure everyone that all had gone exactly as planned. Cary went back to being the polished icon. Sophia returned to the complicated orbit of her own life, bound by loyalties and obligations she could not simply walk away from. The woman who loved them both found herself standing in the empty space they left behind, holding knowledge no one wanted to hear. Over the years, she watched their lives unfold from a distance. Marriages, interviews, awards, photographs in magazines, smiles that looked convincing enough to everyone who needed to believe in them. But every now and then, in a brief, unscripted moment, a glance caught off guard at an event, a quiet answer in a long interview, she would see the shadow of what had not been allowed to happen. A small pause before Sophia said his name, a flash of pain in Cary's eyes when a journalist brought up that particular film. I realized, she says now, that the real story of their love was not about what they did, but about what they were never permitted to choose. It is not the kind of heartbreak that leaves scandalous evidence. There are no explosive fights on record, no dramatic scenes in public. Instead, there is a long, slow erosion of possibility. Two people who could not fully step toward each other without setting off alarms they did not have the power to silence. For her, the hidden truth was this: she had been both witness and collateral. She lost the man she might have had because his heart had already gone somewhere the world would not let him stay. She loved a woman she was never allowed to claim, in a time and industry that had no language for that kind of confession. She remained, quite literally, behind the scenes, while history wrote a cleaner, more comfortable version of events. That is why, at 89, with the end of her own story closer than ever, she finally decided to speak. Not to destroy reputations, not to create a scandal, but to free herself from the weight of being the only person left who knew how much was sacrificed to keep an illusion intact. I was tired, she says quietly. Tired of pretending that what I saw, what I felt, never existed. She pauses, fingers twisting the edge of the armrest, eyes turned somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. When she speaks again, her voice is steady. The world adored Cary Grant, she says. But the man I knew spent years mourning a life he was never allowed to live with her. The interviewer leans forward, ready to ask what exactly she means by that. She looks up, meeting the camera as if, at last, addressing not the crew but the audience who has been watching this illusion for decades, because the most painful part of the hidden truth is still to come. And it begins with a letter that was never meant to be found. The letter appears in the story almost like an accusation. A single envelope, yellowed at the edges, creased in the way paper remembers the hands that held it. No studio logo, no return address. Just a name on the front, written in a careful, deliberate script, Sophia. It was never sent, the woman says. It was never meant to be seen by anyone but her, and yet I am the one who kept it. The biggest shock is not that Cary Grant wrote to Sophia Loren. People write to each other all the time, especially when they cannot speak freely. The shock lies in what the letter reveals about the man behind the mask, and in what he asked this woman to do with it. She remembers the night he gave it to her. It was years after the pride and the passion, long after the official narrative had cooled and set like concrete. They were in London, in a quiet corner of a hotel suite that could have belonged to anyone. No movie posters on the walls, no trophies on the shelves, just neutral furniture, heavy curtains, a bottle of mineral water sweating on the table between them. He took the envelope from inside a leather folder he carried for scripts and contracts. For once, it did not contain a script. His hands, so steady on screen, trembled as he turned it over. "I need you to do something for me," he said. His voice did not have the musical elegance the public adored. It was lower, more hesitant, and I need you to promise you will not change your mind once I am gone. He told her the letter had been written in a hotel room in Spain, on one of those long, airless nights when the distance between what he wanted and what he was allowed to have felt unbearable. In it, he had said what he never dared say out loud, that he loved her, that he had considered asking her to walk away from everything else and choose a different life with him, that, in the end, he did not do it because he could not bear the thought of being the one to destroy the fragile architecture of her hard-won stability. "I am a coward in this," one line reads. "I hide behind contracts and reputations and talk myself into believing it is for your own good. But the truth is simple. I am afraid. Afraid of what they will do to you. Afraid of what will be left of me when the image is taken away." He wrote about seeing her on set, about the way she turned her face toward the light even when no camera was rolling, about the silence of their last day together, when the director called cut for the final time and the crew applauded, and he wanted to say, "Do not go," but instead said, "You were wonderful. Like any colleague, you will hear many things about me," another passage says. "You will read versions of my life that are more comfortable than the truth. I suppose I cannot complain. I helped create them. But if you ever wonder whether any of it was real, please know this. I loved you in the only way I knew how, within the prison I helped build." The woman at 89 folds her hands as she speaks, as if still feeling the weight of that paper between her fingers. "He asked me to destroy it," she says. "He said it was too dangerous, too indulgent, that if it ever came to light, it would hurt people who had done nothing to deserve it." She did not answer immediately. She read the letter in front of him in absolute silence. By the time she reached the end, he was no longer looking at her. He was staring out the window into a darkness that showed him back only his own reflection. At the bottom of the page, there is a final line, written more quickly, the letters slightly uneven. "If fate had been kinder, I would have been brave sooner." When she finished reading, he repeated his request. "Destroy it. Burn it. Let it disappear." Like so many other inconvenient truths, this business had swallowed over the years. "And did you?" the interviewer asks now. She shakes her head. "No." She tells the camera that she could not bring herself to erase the only piece of evidence she had ever seen of the man behind the performance. To everyone else, Cary Grant was the immaculate construct. To her, in that moment, he was simply a human being, admitting that he had failed the one person he loved most by obeying a system that did not care who it hurt. "I put it away," she says, "in a box with other things I did not know how to throw away. Old photographs, ticket stubs, small, foolish relics of a life lived half in the light and half in the dark." The biggest shock does not end there. Years later, after his death, she was contacted about his will. There was no fortune left to her, no glamorous bequest. What he left, formally, was something else. Instructions. Among them, one line that still haunts her. To the person who knows which letter I mean, he had written, "I ask again, let it go. Let her be free of it. Let me be remembered as I was, not as I am in those pages." He never named her directly. He did not have to. She was the only one who had ever held that envelope. "That is when I realized," she says quietly, "that he had carried the same fear to the very end. Not fear of death, fear of truth." She kept the letter anyway. Not out of defiance, she insists, but out of something closer to grief. She could not accept that a love so carefully denied, so systematically erased, would vanish completely just because he was no longer alive to feel it. The next shock came when she learned, almost by accident, that Sophia had never known about it. Decades after the film, in a casual conversation with someone who had worked with Loren much later in her career, she heard the actress had once said, "If he had ever asked, truly asked, I might have made different choices." It is a hypothetical sentiment, offered years after the fact, in another context. But for the woman who had read the unsent letter, it landed like a verdict. She thought he never asked, the woman says. He thought asking would ruin her life. So he stayed silent, and the letter stayed in my hands. 2 lives, permanently altered by a conversation that never happened. A love story edited out before it had the chance to become real, not by scandal or betrayal, but by caution and calculation and the invisible chains of an industry built on appearances. The camera lingers on her face as she says the words she has carried for so long. The truth is, Cary Grant did not just lose Sophia Loren because of Hollywood, she says. He lost her because he believed the lie that the world needed his illusion more than he needed his own happiness. And she lost the chance to know that, at least once in her life, someone was willing to put everything at risk for her. She exhales, a slow, fragile breath. That is the secret, she finishes. Not that they loved each other, people suspected that much. The real secret is that they were both willing to sacrifice that love for a world that did not deserve it. The room is silent. The interviewer has no clever follow-up. There is only the soft buzz of the lights and the faint rustle of paper as she rests her hand on the envelope that survived its own death sentence. On the front, the single word remains, faded but legible, Sophia. But behind the elegance lay a truth neither of them was allowed to live. In the end, the story does not collapse into scandal. It dissolves into something quieter, heavier, and infinitely more human. When she speaks of Cary now, there is no bitterness in her voice, only the kind of sadness that comes from understanding a truth too late. He wasn't a legend to me, she says. He was a man terrified of breaking the world, had spent his whole life holding together. Hollywood rewarded him for being untouchable, unshakable, immaculate. It applauded Sophia for being luminous, obedient to its narrative, effortless in her beauty. But what the industry never allowed either of them was the freedom to want something as simple as a life not shaped by contracts and caution. The woman at 89 folds her hands and looks down as she explains the real cost of the secret she carried. People think heartbreak is loud, she says, but the most painful kind is the one that stays silent for decades, because no one was brave enough to name it. She admits she kept the letter not because she hoped to expose anyone, but because she needed proof that beneath Cary Grant's perfect silhouette, beneath the starched collars and impeccable timing, there was a person who once allowed himself to love with complete sincerity. A man whose greatest fear was not rejection, but the destruction of the illusion he had become trapped inside. Sophia Loren would go on to build a life defined by endurance and brilliance, but even she carried shadows of what might have been. Those who worked with her in her later years recall the way she paused whenever his name surfaced in conversation, a soft delay, the kind that belongs to someone remembering a doorway they almost walked through. The conclusion is not a clean moral wrapped in certainty. It is a whisper of what happens when people choose safety over truth, when 2 lives bend themselves around expectations instead of facing the risk of living honestly. Perhaps the saddest part, the woman says, is that they never realized they were both protecting each other from the same imaginary danger. She touches the envelope one last time, not to expose the past, but to honor it. Because some loves don't fade, they simply become invisible, swallowed by the demands of a world that never cared for the hearts it used as currency. And as the camera lingers on, her face lined, steady, unafraid, she offers the thought that feels like the only ending this story ever deserved. In Hollywood, illusions survive longer than people. But the truth we carry, even in silence, is what outlives us.